Hello, Psychology 135 class. This is Dr. Palmer, here to do my lecture. So this is the lecture for Tuesday, March 7th. And where we left off was we were talking about structured knowledge representations, talking about particularly schemas and the various forms of schemas that we use. And I had started by talking about plot devices and movies. We talked about Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, which is an abstraction of a bunch of different myths from throughout the world and a bunch of different cultures that seem to have very similar steps for the hero as the hero goes on his or her journey. And we finished off by talking about Carl Jung's archetypes, which is a certain kind of schema too, in a way. And there were ideas that, there's like the jester, the lover, the caregiver, the innocent, the magician, and hero, and those kinds of things. And I gave some examples from the series Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings. We can think of the hero as being, Harry, of course, or Frodo and Aragorn, or Luke, or Mal. And you can kind of map consistent sorts of characters, like the wise old man. You have Dumbledore, or Gandalf, or Obi-Wan Kenobi, or Shepard. And they seem to show up time and time again. And that's kind of interesting because we have certain expectations about the kinds of characters that are going to be present in stories that we have. So let's pick up here and think about the idea of scripts. And so a script is a schema that plays out over time. And it has to do with a stereotyped order of events. So some examples are going to a restaurant. You know the steps that are going to happen when you go to a restaurant. You check in, maybe you have to wait, maybe you're seated right away, maybe you seat yourself. And then somebody comes up, they bring you some water, maybe some menus, they take your drink order, then they come back, ask you for appetizers and your entree, then they bring the appetizers out, then they bring your entree out, then they ask you if you want dessert, and etc. Then you pay the check, and we have these expectations for how this is going to go. And those expectations help us to act accordingly. And sometimes you don't really realize how many times you use a script and that you have this automated idea about what's going to happen until you start to go to another culture, for instance. And when you're in another culture, you realize that you just don't know the scripts for that culture. And it brings into sharp relief the idea that you're using all these assumptions in your day-to-day life without realizing it. A couple of other examples of scripts are what you do at a birthday. There's the happy birthday cake script, which is somebody's birthday. People go off in another room. They put candles in a cake. They light the candles. They walk into the room with the cake already lit. Everybody starts singing happy birthday song. You wait for them to finish singing the song, make a wish, blow out the candles. And there's this set of procedures, and we all sort of know how that goes. We've also established a script for a classroom lecture. You come in, you sit down, you pick your seat, you sit and wait for the class to start. The professor comes in, he or she kind of opens up the lecture, and on and on. We've got expectations for the order of events, and we rely on these expectations all the time. This is a little tongue-in-cheek, but I found this on the internet a couple years ago. I thought it was really funny. This is for a student to decide whether you should get up. Let's imagine you're very tired, so is your alarm sounding? If no, then just keep going to bed. If it is, are your eyes open? And you wait till your eyes are open. Is it Saturday? If it's yes, then you reset the alarm, but if it's no, you say, okay, do I have an exam today? If no, do I have first period to spare? If yes, then you reset the alarm and you start over. If no, do you have at least 30 minutes to get ready? If no, then okay, it's time to get up. So that's kind of a kind of joking example of what it would take to get a time to get out of bed script. So how do we get these structured knowledge representations, and what's the format of these representations? And there's two broad classes of theories about how you get these knowledge representations. One is the idea of an abstraction theory, and the other class of theories are instance theories. So abstraction theories say that on the basis of your experience with a number of examples of a particular type of event or person or object, you develop something like a prototype. You develop a prototype representation. If you're familiar with philosophy, this is sort of like Plato's idea of kind of ideal object. So Plato had this theory that somewhere in heaven there resides the perfect, version of anything, the perfect apple, the perfect cup of coffee, the perfect car, the perfect ballpoint pen. Probably Plato wasn't thinking about ballpoint pens because they weren't invented yet, but the idea is that all the examples of those objects we encounter on Earth are slightly flawed. But if we kind of average them all together, like all the apples you've ever seen, that somewhere you've got some prototype apple in your mind. So the idea with abstraction theories is that based on your experience, you develop something like an average or a median representation that represents a summation of all of your experiences with the particular instances. And what you store in your mind, according to abstraction theories, are mental prototypes that are sort of abstracted away and maybe more than and more perfect than any particular example of the thing that you've encountered. The other end of the spectrum is the idea of instance theories. And so in instance theories, what it says is that you don't remember an abstracted prototype. Instead, what you're doing is you're storing particular instances. So if you think of an apple, for instance, you are thinking about all the particular apples, maybe the most recent apples that you've seen, or apples from your childhood, or something like that. But your concept of apple is not some prototype apple. It's a collection of individual apples that you can recall. And if you think back to our lecture on object recognition theories, you could sort of map there are two kinds of object recognition theories onto these two types of mental representations of knowledge theories. The structural description approach to knowledge, to object recognition, that's the recognition by components Biederman theory, is something like an abstraction theory. You don't remember a bunch of particular mugs, you remember the abstract shape, the structural description of a mug, that there's a vertical hollow cylinder with a curved cylinder attached on two sides. So that would be the idea of abstraction theory in terms of object recognition. On the other hand, the view-based theories of object recognition that say that you recognize, for instance, a mug by having a whole bunch of mental templates or snapshots of a bunch of different mugs that you've encountered, and that when you see a new mug, you match them to some particular image that you have stored in your mind. That's something like an instance theory, that the way you recognize objects is through the individual objects that you have a memory for. So that's the idea of abstraction and instance theories. And in a moment here, I'm going to give you some evidence that we do develop prototypes. There's some pretty good laboratory evidence that you do generate prototype representations of things. And the truth is we probably have both representations. That when you think of an apple, there's not only sort of an ideal apple, but there's also a bunch of examples of particular apples that you have experienced recently or that are particularly memorable for you. Now let's think about where some of these things happen in the brain. And interestingly, when you think about different kinds of representations, it seems that they occur in different parts of the brain. So if you're talking about biological categories, those are things like animals, trees, anything that's sort of biological. Those mental representations of those kinds of objects appear to be stored in the temporal lobe. Whereas artifactual categories, so these are human-made tools. So think like screwdriver, hammer, pliers, those kind of things. Those appear to be stored in frontoparietal regions. And there's some kind of sense about why these things would be stored in those parts of the brain. And the idea is that in your temporal lobes, you're storing biological categories because biological entities, like apples and dogs and cats and horses and people, things like that, they have implicit properties. They have visual properties that define what they are. Whereas artifactual categories have implicit uses. So we talked already about these two major processing pathways in the brain, the dorsal stream that goes up to parietal lobe, which is your where-how pathway. Where are objects located and how would you grasp them or use them? It makes sense that artifactual categories might be stored near those regions of the brain for easier access by those parts of the brain. So if you're thinking about a hammer or a pair of pliers or a screwdriver, there's a particular way you grab a screwdriver, a particular way you hold it so that you can use it. And if you have that knowledge of screwdrivers up in your frontal parietal region, your parietal region has your spatial layout mental representation, and your frontal lobe has your motor cortex. So if you're thinking about objects that have uses, it makes sense to store them near the parts of your brain that would actually use them. Whereas if you're thinking about biological categories, those are more in the ventral stream, the what pathway in the inferotemporal cortex. And those are defined by their properties, their visual properties. So what defines a cat or a dog is the way they look, the shape of their tail, the size, the way they have their legs, their fur, their heads, their ears. Those are all things that you use to recognize a cat or a dog. So people can have some kinds of brain damage, and they can lose one of these categories and retain the other. So there are some people who cannot recognize biological entities. They can't recognize sheep or cows or horses or cats or dogs, but they can recognize tools, hammers and screwdrivers and pliers and those kinds of things, saws. But there's also a complementary. So there are some people who can recognize biological categories like, you know, the animals, trees, those kinds of things, but they've lost the ability to recognize or use artifactual things like hammers and screwdrivers and that sort of thing. So we have this kind of double dissociation and this distinction, and it appears to reflect where these things are stored, and where they're stored in the brain makes sense, especially in terms of the artifactual categories, because they're stored near the parts of the brain that would use those kinds, that would guide your use of those things. All right, so the next thing I'm going to show you is this really cool result from two researchers, Franks and Bransford, and these names should be familiar to you if you think back to the little thing we did on the ants ate the sweet jelly in the kitchen and all that sort of thing. That was Bransford and Franks. So this is a study by Franks and Bransford. And if you think back to the study with the ants and the jelly and all that sort of thing, their notion was that you don't remember the particulars of the sentences that you saw. What you do is you abstract away something like the overall meaning, the propositions of those sentences. So that was in a linguistic set of stimuli. And now what they're going to do is they're going to look at what happens when you see visual stimuli. So let's see if I can explain this experiment. The setup is that they had a whole bunch of 3x5 cards, and they drew different shapes on those cards. So if you look at this one in the upper left, this is the base configuration for experiment 1. And what it had was a large blue square on the left with a small red triangle inside, and a large green circle on the right with a small yellow diamond inside. And that acted as the base configuration. And then Franks and Bransford came up with a number of moves or operations or ways that you could change that base configuration. And here are a bunch of them. This one's called DSQ, that means delete square. So what you can see is that this one's different than the base configuration because they've deleted the square. This one is a major permutation. So permutation means a kind of flip-flop. And so what they've done here is they just flipped the green circle and the yellow diamond to the left, and the blue square and the small red triangle to the right. So that's the difference between the base. It's just they've flipped the major one. Here, let's go down to this is minor permutation 1. So instead of flipping the position horizontally, what they've done is they've flip-flopped. Instead of a large blue square with a small red triangle inside, they've flipped that, they've permuted that, so now it's a large red triangle with a small blue square inside. That's a minor permutation of 1. Here's a minor permutation of 2. Instead of the green circle with the small yellow diamond inside, excuse me, now it's a large yellow diamond with a small green circle inside. And over here we have sub 1, so that what that means is in the first column you're going to substitute the large object. So Instead of a large blue square, now you have a large blue hexagon. Here's sub 2. In sub 2, what you do is you substitute one of the smaller things. So instead of a small yellow diamond, now it's a small yellow heart. So these are examples of the different moves that they defined, and they might string some of these operations or these moves together. So in the bottom right, you have a major permutation plus a minor permutation of 1, and you delete the square. So let's see if we can walk through that. Major permutation, what they did is they flip-flopped the position of these, so it would look like this. Then a minor permutation of 1. So instead of it being a large blue square with a small red triangle inside, they did the minor permutation of 1. So that it was a large red triangle with a small blue square inside, but then they did the DSQ, the delete square operation, like this. So then they deleted the square, right? So this configuration here would be 3 moves away from the base configuration, if that makes sense. So you've got this base configuration, and you have all these legal moves that they defined, and then they might have 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 moves that they do to the base configuration. So the way the experiment worked is they developed a whole bunch of these index cards with all of these shapes and everything on there. The subjects in this experiment did not know what these particular moves were. They weren't defined for them or anything. If you were a participant in this experiment, all you knew was that they handed you a deck of these index cards, and they told you, okay, take your time, go through this whole deck, and I think they could only go through it once, and they could look at each card for up to 5 seconds, and they were supposed to just memorize as many of these cards as they could. So if you're a participant in this study, you're handed this deck of cards, and you just look through them one after another, and that was during the study phase of the experiment. Then they'd have you go off and do something else as a distractor task, maybe do some math problems or something like that. And then they had a second phase, and in the second phase, you had to do a recognition test. So they showed you a bunch of these cards, and they said, was this one of the cards that you studied or not? And let's go look at the data now. The way that you rated them, or what your response was you rated them on a scale from -5 to +5. Where -5 is you're absolutely convinced that was not one of the ones you studied in the deck. 0 means you could be either yes or no, and then +5 means you're convinced that that really was something that you studied in the deck. So that's the confidence rating that people generated. And here are the data. What you can see is that for the base configuration, people had the highest confidence for that base configuration. And then as you moved 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 of these moves away from the base configuration, people's confidence went down, 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 pretty much in lockstep with the number of transformations. So there's 2 really cool things about this data. The first thing is the farther away you move from the base configuration, the less confident people were that they had seen those, despite the fact that they had. And so that's really interesting. That indicates that the farther away you move from a prototype, the less confidence people have that they had seen that. And the second thing that's really cool about this study, and this is kind of something I haven't told you yet, but during the study phase, so during the study phase, participants never saw the base configuration. So this base configuration was not present in the study. All people saw were these things that were 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 moves away. But when they were shown the base configuration later in the recall phase, they were the most confident they had seen that base configuration. So this is evidence right here. That's a really cool result. That is evidence that you do seem to abstract prototypes from all of the things that you see. So what happened was people never saw this base configuration, but based on all these moves around it, their brain abstracted away and developed a prototype representation such that when people were asked if they had seen the prototype, they were the most confident that they had seen it, despite the fact that they never had. So I think that's a really cool result. And here's experiment 2. There were some details that they methodological details that they cleaned up about their stimuli. But what you can see is that the thing replicated. They replicated the same result. They even had a third experiment that replicated this also. And again, the farther away, the number of transformations away from the base, people's confidence went down. And they were the most confident they had seen the base configuration, even though they never actually had seen the base configuration in the study phase of the experiment. Okay, so that's our last slide here. That is the end of the lecture for chapter 5. And now what we're going to do is we're going to move on and start talking about chapter 6. We're going to talk about human memory, encoding, and storage. And let me print. Okay, so here we go. Human memory, encoding, and storage. And just a word about the chapters we're going to do on memory. Memory is a huge topic. And we're going to try to break it up into roughly 2 stages. So it's going to be spread across 2 chapters, chapter 6 and chapter 7. Chapter 6 is about kind of like getting information into the system. How do you encode things? How do you learn new memories? And chapter 7 is going to be mostly centered on how do you pull memories out? How do you retrieve memories that you have encoded? Now, it's not a very clean distinction. Because, of course, if we want to see what factors influence encoding and storage, you have to have people retrieve things. And if you want to see how people, what factors influence retrieval, you have to have people encode things in the first place. So we're going to try to follow this distinction, but you should understand that we're going to be talking about retrieval somewhat in week 6, and we're going to be talking about encoding and storage somewhat in week 7. But it's about the best way we can do things as far as that goes. So let's talk about this movie, which I think is really fascinating. There's a movie called Memento, and it came out, 10 or 15 years ago at this point. And if you haven't seen this movie, I think it's on Netflix. It's a great movie. And it's about a guy named Leonard. And Leonard has he has brain damage. And his brain damage means that he cannot form new memories. So in the movie, he claims that he has no short-term memory, which means that when things happen to him, if it happened 5 or 10 minutes ago, he can't even remember what happened 5 or 10 minutes ago. He can remember his childhood. He can remember things in his life up to the moment when he had his brain damage, but he can't remember anything afterwards. And the movie is really fascinating because it simulates for the audience what it's like for Leonard to live his life not knowing what happened immediately before. And the way that this movie does this is the beginning of the movie, as the movie opens up, it shows you like the last 5 minutes of what happens in the plot. It shows you the last 5 minutes, and then it backs up and shows you what happened for the 5 minutes before that. Then it backs up and shows you what happened for the 5 minutes before that. And then it goes back and, so you're watching the movie backwards, in other words. And you never know what just happened right before. So it gives you the experience of what it was like for Leonard to never know what had just happened because he never had any memories. All he was dealing with was the present moment. So Leonard claims to have no short-term memory, but since we're going to be educated cognitive psychologists, you're going to understand that actually all Leonard had was his short-term memory. Anything that you would have had to encode into long-term memory, so that would be things that happened 5 minutes or longer ago, are things that he doesn't have any longer. So we call that anterograde amnesia, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but there's 2 types of amnesia. One is retrograde amnesia, and the other is anterograde amnesia. And from the moment of injury, okay, so like from the moment you had a car accident or a stroke or got hit, if you're Gilligan, on Gilligan's Island, you get hit on the head by a coconut, if you forget everything that happened before that moment, that's retrograde, like backwards in time. But if you have the inability to form new memories after that, that's anterograde amnesia. And in the movies, retrograde amnesia is by far the most common thing people depict. You get hit on the head or you get into a car accident and then you forget who you are and you don't know your own name and you don't know where you're from. That's actually in real life very rare. And the reason is that memories are stored all over the brain not just in a single area. So if you had damage to some area that would cause you to forget everything you ever knew, it would probably be damage that spread so far throughout the brain that you're probably dead at that point. There are some psychological syndromes or disorders that can lead people to psychologically repress their past. One is something called dissociative fugue, and that's the kind of thing that Jason Bourne had in the Jason Bourne series. That's a form of retrograde amnesia. But by far in real life, the most common thing to happen is for you to get damage to certain parts of your brain, which we will talk about, particularly the hippocampus and the temporal lobes. And if you have damage to those areas are critical for forming new memories. And so if you have damage to those areas, that is one single place where you can disrupt the formation of new memories after the traumatic event. So Leonard says he has no short-term memory, but in fact, he does have short-term memory. That's all he has. He can't form any new long-term memories. That's his problem. And so he technically has anterograde amnesia. And in the movie, the way he remembers things is he takes pictures with a Polaroid camera and he writes on them. So he puts them in his pocket so he can remember later. His wife was murdered. That's the last thing he remembers. So he's obsessed with trying to find the person who murdered his wife. And so he takes notes to try to remember things. He gets tattoos on his body. So when he wakes up, he has no idea where he is or what room he's in, and he goes into the bathroom and he sees all these things on his body that he's tattooed, and that's how he tries to stay focused on finding his wife's murderer. Anyway, Memento, great movie, and it features somebody who has anterograde amnesia. So let's talk about your memory system. Let's talk about how memories come into your mind, into your brain, and we're going to talk about sort of 3 major stages of memory, going from the most ephemeral to the most long-lasting. And those 3 phases are sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. So let's begin by talking about sensory memory. In sensory memory, you have a short-term sensory store. And this is certainly true for both vision and hearing. So in vision, it's called iconic memory. And it's basically the idea that if you see something, so let's imagine I put a picture on a computer screen, then I turn that picture off, you will continue to experience that image for about 1 to 200 milliseconds. Sometimes longer, sometimes less. There's some variations there depending on the brightness of the stimulus and whether there's something interfering with it, et cetera. But that's iconic memory, that there's this fading trace of a visual experience that you have for about half a second after the experience, after the stimulus is gone. And so, for instance, if you're walking by somebody on campus and you happen to just look up at their face right as you're walking by them, you think, oh wait, was that somebody I know? You have a split second where you can continue to sort of hold their face in your mind and inspect it, and you get a second chance to perceive it. To see if that really was your friend or not, whether you should, say, hey, turn around and stop them. So that is iconic memory. And in a second, I'm gonna show you my explanation for why I think we have iconic memory. But let me also explain about the auditory version of this, which is called echoic memory, like an echo. And that is an auditory sensory store, and it lasts for up to 10 seconds. So this is much longer than your iconic memory. And this is when, when you hear something, and maybe you didn't catch what was said the first time, or whatever you heard the first time, and you can sort of replay it, so you get a second chance to perceive it. So for instance, you're at the dinner table and somebody says, hey, and you go, what? Oh, please pass me the salt. Okay, cool, here's the salt. They didn't have a chance to repeat themselves. It's more like you had a chance to replay that sensory buffer and get a second opportunity to hear what that was that they said. So why have echoic memory? Well, it gives you 2 chances to perceive things that you may not have heard the first time. And it's a way to kind of rewind the tape and listen back to something one more time. Why have iconic memory? Well, here's my explanation, and this is based on my dissertation work at UCLA. I studied something called dynamic occlusion, which is something like these situations. All right, so you've got a, turn this down a little bit. All right, so we've got this fire truck that's going by, and what you should notice is that at any given moment in time, there's actually very little of the fire truck that's visible through the gaps in this tree. But, you know, you see a fire truck, right? How is it that your mind does that? So what I did was I spent a lot of time in Photoshop and I isolated all of the individual fragments that were visible through these gaps in the leaves here. So I just took a bunch of frames and I actually just showed what you actually could see, right? So here's what you actually see, just very little bits and pieces. But you notice that your actual experience, the phenomenology of seeing the fire truck was not that it was fragmented and broken. You perceived a whole fire truck. So my explanation for why we have the visual icon is that it allows us to accumulate these fragments over time. So here's what I did is I just kind of kept collecting all the fragments that eventually became visible of the fire truck, and I put them all together. I kind of put them all in registry with each other on an object-centered reference frame, and I accumulated these over time. So my explanation for why we have a visual icon is to not only get a second chance to see things, but when you're walking around the environment and some things come into and out of view, there's this dynamic occlusion that's happening. This is how your brain can accumulate that information over time to enable you to perceive whole objects despite fragmentary input. So that's your kind of sensory memory. Let's talk about short-term memory. And we're going to talk about short-term memory and working memory. And the two concepts are pretty much interchangeable, except that there's this distinction that short-term memory is kind of like just pure storage of something in your short-term memory, whereas working memory has this implication that you're actually manipulating the items in memory and not just storing them. So first and foremost, one of the earliest findings was that we have a very limited memory span. So if you listen to a bunch of, like if I just give you a bunch of numbers, and we're going to do a demo when I come back on Thursday, we'll do this demo in class. I'm going to give you 20 two-digit numbers. You're going to see each one for 2 seconds. And what you need to do is just try to remember as many of those numbers as you can. So you're going to see all 20, and then it's going to tell you recall, and then you should just write down as many numbers as you can. So if you do that, what you'll find is that people can remember somewhere about, between 5 and 9 numbers on average, about 7 plus or minus 2. And this indicates that we have a limited capacity storage system, that your short-term memory is not infinite. In fact, it's some sort of limited capacity store. And there are also some kind of interesting details about the shape of the recall curve that comes from these sorts of experiments. And we'll cover that on Thursday. Actually, there's going to be a few demos that we're going to catch up and do on Thursday. So that's the idea of a memory span. And let me show you the Atkinson and Shiffrin 1968 model of memory, which was, as you can tell by 1968, it's one of the earliest memory models. And here it is. So the idea is you start with things happening in the environment. So you get the sensory input, you see things, you hear things, etc. Those things go into your sensory memory. So that's your iconic memory and your echoic memory. And then depending on your attention, you attend to some of that sensory memory. That gets into short-term memory. And then according to Atkinson and Shiffrin, you keep things in short-term memory and you rehearse them. So you say them over and over to yourself, or you mentally refresh the images that you're thinking about. And you can maintain things in short-term memory for a long time if you continuously rehearse them. Although you will forget some things. So they might decay, just they get old and they kind of drop out of short-term memory, or they might get displaced if you keep trying to remember more things. They might knock certain things out of short-term memory before you have a chance to remember them. So short-term memory has a limited capacity. If you try to put too much stuff in there, it's going to displace other items. And according to according to Atkinson and Schifrin, you just hold things in short-term memory and you rehearse them for a certain amount of time. And then as long as you keep them in short-term memory, eventually they will get into long-term memory. And your long-term memory is a more permanent kind of storage, so that you don't have to be currently thinking about the items in long-term memory. They're just stored, and then you can recall them, and there's an arrow going from long-term memory, from LTM to short-term memory, to STM. So throughout these next couple of chapters, STM means short-term memory, LTM means long-term memory. So you have not only from STM to LTM, but you also have retrieval from LTM to STM. So you can think, okay, what is your, I don't know, think about what your best friend, what their favorite hobby is, or what they like to do, or the last time you saw them. Those things were in your long-term memory somewhere. Now you're thinking about them, so now they've been put into your short-term memory, and they're the current sort of contents of consciousness. So Atkinson and Schifrin said, the way that you get things into long-term memory is you just sort of hold them in short-term memory, and you continue to rehearse them, and then that will eventually get those items to go into your long-term memory. Well, Craig and Lockhart came along in 1972, and they said, you know, it's not just holding things in short-term memory. That doesn't seem to be sufficient. It's more about how you process the items in short-term memory. How do you think about them? Do you think about very surface-level characteristics, like if you're reading a bunch of words or something, if I give you a word list, if you think about just like if the words are in capitals or lowercase or something like that, that's a very kind of surfacey sort of processing. That's not very deep. If you think about how the words sound, so what rhymes with the word, or what are the kind of acoustic properties of the word, that's a little bit deeper kind of processing. But the deepest form of processing is if you can do this, what they call semantic processing, where you're thinking about the actual meaning of the words, and in particular, how those words maybe relate to you, relate to your life, or relate to other concepts that you know. And so according to Craig and Lockhart, it's not just maintaining things in short-term memory that determines whether they get into long-term memory. It's how deeply you process the items in short-term memory to get them into long-term memory. So we're also going to do a demo. We're going to have you learn, we're going to give you 3 different lists, word lists, and I'm going to have you process them either shallowly, kind of medium, or deeply, and we're going to see how many you remember based on those 3 lists. So I'm going to punt on that, and we're going to come back and do that on Thursday when I'm back in town. Okay, so as I mentioned, short-term memory is also referred to as working memory. And working memory implies that you are manipulating the items in short-term memory. And the person with the leading theory on working memory is a guy named Baddeley. And Baddeley and Hitch, 1986, and then Baddeley, 1990, are the 2 theories of working memory. And Baddeley's theory of working memory has 4 components: a phonological loop, a visual spatial sketchpad, a central executive, and an episodic buffer. And let's talk about the kind of structure of Baddeley's working memory model. So let's talk about these 3 subcomponents. That is the visual spatial sketchpad, the episodic buffer, and the phonological loop. And then I'm going to talk about the central executive. So first, let's start by talking about the visual spatial sketchpad. Visual spatial sketchpad is for storing items in working memory that are visual in nature. So mental imagery invokes your visual spatial sketchpad. So for instance, if you're out furniture shopping and you're looking at a new desk, you're trying to find a new desk for your office, and your office has kind of a small limited space, you've got just a little bit of area between 2 bookshelves. So you might go look at a desk in the furniture store, and then you might mentally imagine your office and then try to place that desk and think about, would that fit between your 2 bookshelves in your office? Well, what you're doing is a visual spatial process. You're using your visual spatial sketchpad. So thinking about that desk and what it would look like in your room, that's a very visual activity. And then is it small enough to fit between your 2 bookshelves? That is a spatial activity. So that's the idea of the visual spatial sketchpad. So let me give you a couple of other examples real quick. if you're telling your friend directions to your house, and you're telling them, and let's say that you're going to give them egocentric route-based directions. You should know what that means from the previous lecture. So you're going to say, all right, I want you to come out of campus, turn right on Santa Clara, go to, I don't know, 7th Street, turn left, and then you're going to see a shopping center on your right, and then whatever. You're thinking about what those streets look like, and you're imagining the map in your mind, and you're telling the person what landmarks they're going to see at different intersections. That's all visual spatial information that you're loading into your working memory so that you can manipulate those symbols and think about them and give directions to your friend. Next, let's talk about the episodic buffer. And the episodic buffer is when you're recalling information and thinking about the order of events. So for instance, if I tell you, oh yeah, the party was great, Charlie was there, and when Charlie got there, Bob was already there, but Adam arrived before either of them. Well, I told in my sentence, Charlie, then B, Bob, and then Adam. But actually the order that they arrived to the party was Adam, Bob, Charlie. So the order that you got the information is not the same as the order that that actually occurred, that those events actually occurred. So your episodic buffer is going to help you put those things into the correct order. Another example, I think maybe I used this example when we talked about Baddeley's working memory model, I think on Thursday. So realizing that right now that this is just a review, but another example would be if you're police and you're investigating a crime scene or something like that, you're going to interview witnesses and they're going to tell you all kinds of stuff. And it's your job to think about all of the facts and the information you have and then to put them into the proper order so that you kind of rearrange things so you understand the proper order. That's the idea of the episodic buffer. And then finally, there's the phonological loop. And the phonological loop is as if you're actually pronouncing things and you're saying them to yourself in your kind of mind's ear, not your mind's eye, your mind's ear. And the phonological loop involves sort of repeating lists over and over to maintain them in your working memory. So those are the three subcomponents: visual spatial sketchpad, episodic buffer, and phonological loop. And then the central executive is the part of your brain that coordinates between all three of those buffers and keeps them separate and understands like what attention and resources should go to the different subsystems and keeps all those things straight. It's kind of the strategy and decision-making portion of your mind, of your working memory, that sequences your behaviors and helps you understand which things to do first, second, third, fourth. So that's the idea of the central executive. And I think we mentioned that central executive is mostly stored in the frontal lobe, and that seems to be the place where your kind of strategy and inhibition and sequencing of behaviors is taking place in the brain. Wait, let me go back here. Yeah, okay, so we've covered that. Okay, cool. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the idea of activation in your memory. We, in the previous chapter, we talked about your representations of knowledge. And we talked about the idea that you have a semantic network. And that what it is a whole bunch of concepts that are linked together. And you might have multiple links from a concept. So like take the concept of apple, you know that's a fruit, you know that there's like Fuji apples and Gala apples and Granny Smith apples, and you have mental images of all those things. You also know that Apple is a kind of computer, and that you might have an Apple Macintosh, right? And so you know all these things about the Apple. You might also associate that with the Big Apple, thinking about New York. That's a nickname for Manhattan. It's the Big Apple. So you have a semantic network. And interestingly, as you think about different elements in your semantic network, when you activate one concept, it spreads and it seems to activate other related concepts. So for instance, if I tell you to think about stripes, for whatever reason, I prime you with the word stripes, if I ask you then to verify tell me if the next thing that is an animal, if I tell you tiger, you're going to be faster to verify that a tiger is an animal than you would be to verify that a lion is an animal. And that's because I caused you to think about stripes. Stripes are associated with tiger. Tiger got some activation. And so it was a little bit more activated than lion, which doesn't have as much activation. It isn't associated with stripes. And actually, it's funny because I was trying to think of an example besides tiger, another animal, and because I thought about tiger, I thought about lion, and so that ended up being the one I thought of. So that's almost like 2 steps removed from stripes, and that's an idea. That's an example of spreading activation. I could have thought of a rat or a mouse or a gerbil, like now that we learned what a gerbil was from the quiz the other day, or I could think of an elephant or a snake or any other animal. But because I had been saying tiger, I actually just demonstrated the notion of spreading activation because I thought of a lion. And if I also thought about bears, lions and tigers and bears, then that's also an example of spreading activation. So let's go through this example from the book, which I think sometimes people have a little bit of a hard time getting at first. This is based on the ACT theory, and I forget exactly what ACT stands for. I forgot. But ACT is a neural network model of memory, and it was created by the author of your textbook. Your textbook author is going to be talking about ACT a lot because it's basically his baby that he created. So here's the idea. And we're gonna give you a particular phenomenon. So here's the thing we're going to try to explain in this diagram, and this is your textbook author's particular example. But if I tell you 3 words, okay, and then so I tell you the words Bible, animals, and flood, your probably number one association with those 3 things, at least if you're familiar with sort of the Christian tradition or I guess even the Jewish tradition, because this is an Old Testament story. But if you're familiar with that tradition, if I tell you Bible, animals, and flood, your association is going to be Noah and the story of how there was a big flood and Noah took 2 of each kind of animal onto the ark and they were saved from the flood. But what's interesting is that if I tell you the word Bible by itself, you would not think of Noah as your number one thing. You'd think about other things. If I told you animals, you would not think about animals in particular. Noah would not be your first concept if you thought about animals. And if I told you about flood, Noah is also not going to be the first thing you think about in terms of a flood. But somehow the combination of Bible, animals, and flood definitely lead to the concept of Noah, despite the fact that Noah is not the top associate of any one of those 3 concepts. So let me kind of exit